The first sound Wren Hale heard that morning was the stove catching. The second was her own breath, quiet and careful, the way a person breathes when they have learned that sound itself can be a trespass. She had been awake before the light touched the window. Not because anyone had called her, not because the day asked anything of her yet. She rose because lying still in the dark gave her too much time to think, and thinking lately had become a dangerous country. The cot beside the pantry was narrow, the blanket was thin. Neither of those things had ever been offered as a complaint by Wren, because complaining required a kind of standing she did not have in that house. She folded the blanket with the same care she gave everything, not because anyone would notice, but because her mother had taught her that the way you treat small things says something about who you are when no one is watching. Her mother had been gone for 2 years. Wren tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, pulled on her boots in the dark, and moved toward the stove before the rest of the house woke. This was the shape of her mornings in Marvel and Boyd Vane's house. She brought kindling from the back porch, coaxed the fire with her breath until the smoke turned from gray to white, washed the dishes left from the night before, swept the floor. Before chairs scraped across it, carried the feed bucket to the chickens while dew still bent the grass. By the time her cousins came stumbling into the kitchen with their hair loose and their voices loud, Wren already had smoke in her hair and ash on the backs of her hands. No one said good morning. That was not unusual. Marvel Vane was a woman who moved through her house with the particular authority of someone who had decided long ago what everything was worth. She could look at a cut of meat and name its price to the penny. She could look at a bolt of cloth and tell you how many dresses it would yield. She had applied this same precision to Wren from the first week the girl arrived, and the number she had arrived at was one she had never spoken aloud, but had communicated clearly in every small way that counted. Boyd was quieter about it. He sat behind his newspaper and his coffee and let Marvell run the arithmetic of the household. He was not a cruel man. He was something more common than cruel. He was a man who found it easier not to look closely at things that might require him to feel something. At breakfast, there were 5 biscuits on the plate. Boyd took 2. Marvell took 1. The cousins took 1 each. Wren stood at the stove with her back to the table, turning a pan that did not need turning, and waited. The plate went around and came back empty. Marvel noticed her noticing. "You had scraps while you were cooking?" Marvel said. Her voice was not unkind. That was the particular skill of it. It sounded like a statement of fact rather than a door closing. Wren had not had scraps. She had not eaten anything since the heel of bread she had saved from supper the night before. But she nodded because the only thing worse than being hungry was giving someone the satisfaction of knowing how hungry you were. She turned back to the pan. It was while she was clearing the table that the plate slipped, not a deliberate thing, not a protest. Her hands were wet from the dishwater and the plate already cracked through the middle from some earlier accident that had nothing to do with Wren, simply left her fingers and struck the floor. It broke into 3 pieces clean along the crack that had always been there. The kitchen went still the way rooms go still before something changes. Marvell set down her coffee cup. "That," she said, "is enough." Wren was already on her knees gathering the pieces. "I'm sorry, I'll pay it back." "With what?" Marvel's voice had not risen. That was the thing about Marvel. She did not need to raise her voice. "You have nothing to pay anything back with. You have never had anything." Boyd folded his newspaper. He set it on the table with both hands, the way a man sets something down when he has made a decision. "Wren," he said, "you're 14. She looked up from the floor. He was not looking at her. "A girl your age," he said, "can find work if she wants it." The cousins had gone very still behind their mother. The younger one had a biscuit halfway to her mouth and had forgotten to finish the motion. Wren looked from Boyd to Marvel. She looked for something in either face that would tell her this was the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of one. There was nothing like that in either face. "I do work," she said. She had not meant to say it. The words came out before the part of her that knew better could stop them. Marvel stood. "Work with gratitude is different from work with resentment. I will not have resentment in this house." Wren wanted to say that she was not resentful. She wanted to say that she had carried water and mended clothes and fed the chickens every morning for 8 months without once asking for anything she had not been given. She wanted to say that gratitude was something she had been performing so long she had almost forgotten what it felt like to simply exist in a room without calculating whether her presence was acceptable. She said none of it. Marvel went to the pantry. She came back with an old flour sack that had been used for storing rags. She packed Wren's 2 shirts, one of them already thin at the elbows, and the cracked hairbrush, and the photograph that had lived under the cot in a careful fold of cloth. She did not look at the face in the photograph. She tied the sack with a length of kitchen twine and set it on the table in front of Wren. Wren did not take it immediately. "Could I sleep in this shed?" she asked. The question came out smaller than she had intended. "Just until I find work. I can still haul water. I won't eat anything." Boyd stood and opened the front door. Light came in across the porch boards, pale and thin, the kind of light that belonged to very early morning and made everything look unfinished. "If we let you stay one more night," he said, "it becomes 2, then a week, then another year." He was not wrong about the logic of it. Wren understood that. She understood it in the way a person understands a locked door. The reasoning was sound. It was only the person standing outside it who suffered. She took the flour sack because there was nothing else to take. Her cousins watched from behind their mother's apron. Neither of them moved toward her. No one put a hand on her shoulder. No one said her mother's name, which had been Eleanor, and which no one in that house had spoken aloud since the week Wren arrived. She walked across the porch. For a long, foolish second she stood at the edge of the steps and believed Marvell might call after her, that something in the woman might shift, that whatever calculation she had made might resolve itself differently at the last moment. The door closed. Then came the bolt. That sound stayed with Wren longer than any word spoken in that house. It was not loud. It was the sound a thing makes when it was always going to happen, when the only question was the timing. She stood with the flour sack in one hand and listened to that sound settle into the morning air, and then she walked down the porch steps and did not look back. She went by the lower road. The lower road ran behind the church and along the edge of the old Dempsey pasture before it rejoined the main street near the feed store. Fewer people used it in the mornings. Fewer people meant fewer faces, and fewer faces meant fewer expressions Wren would have to interpret and respond to and carry afterward. The flour sack bumped against her hip with every step. The twine cut into her palm. She did not switch hands. Her other hand stayed near her side, pressed lightly against the place where her mother's photograph rested beneath the thin cloth of her dress pocket. She had moved it there before Marvell could see. A small act of preservation, one of many she had learned without being taught. The day had not warmed yet. The sky above the fields was the color of pewter, the kind of sky that could not make up its mind about rain. Wren's boots left prints in the damp earth of the lower road, and behind her the prints filled slowly with shadow. Near the churchyard she slowed. The white church had always looked kind from the road. Its bell tower leaned slightly, and in spring wild clover grew along the fence. Wren had sat in the back pew every Sunday for 8 months, careful not to sing too loud, careful not to let her elbow extend past the invisible line that marked the space the family occupied and the narrower space that was hers by sufferance. She tried the side door. Locked. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the iron latch, not because she expected anything, but because the gesture felt like the honest conclusion of a long pattern. Then she let go and walked on. Mrs. Cotter came out of the dry goods shop across the street with a basket over one arm. She was a small woman with quick eyes and the habit of noticing things and then deciding with equal quickness what she would do about them. She saw Wren. Wren knew she saw her because the woman's steps slowed for exactly 1/2 of a second. Her eyes moved to the flour sack, then to the road behind Wren, then forward, and then she looked away. Not with anger, not with malice. With the careful, practiced expression of a person who had decided that this particular problem did not belong to her. Wren lowered her eyes and walked on. Past the schoolhouse, voices floated from open windows. A girl laughed. Someone dragged a chair. For a moment, Wren allowed herself the thought of sitting at a desk with a slate in front of her, with a teacher saying her name the way teachers said names when they were simply reading a roll, and every name was equal on the list. The thought dissolved before it became anything useful. Girls who had been told to make themselves useful somewhere else did not return to school. At the edge of the miller's property, a few green apples lay in the grass outside the fence line, fallen and uncollected. Wren stopped. Her stomach had been tight since morning and was tighter now, the particular tightness of hunger that had become familiar enough to stop registering as pain and had become instead a kind of company. She reached for the nearest apple. Then she pulled her hand back. Her mother had told her once, sitting at a kitchen table, that no longer existed in a house. Wren could no longer enter. Hunger can empty your stomach, but don't let it empty your name. She had been too young to fully understand it then. She understood it now. She left the apples where they lay and kept walking. By mid-afternoon, the tidy houses had given way to storage barns, and the barns to sagging fences, and the fences to open fields where the grass grew tall and ungoverned. The road had thinned to ruts. Wren's feet hurt. The leather of her left boot had cracked near the toe, and with each step the crack opened slightly and admitted a thin line of cold air. She stopped at the edge of a ditch and sat on the bank. In her apron pocket was a small square of cornbread she had wrapped in cloth the night before. She had taken it from the kitchen shelf where it had been left from supper, the piece no one had wanted dry at the edges already hardening. She broke it in half. She ate the smaller half slowly, chewing with the deliberate attention of someone who knows they cannot afford to waste anything, including the experience of eating. Then she wrapped the larger half and put it back. For morning, she told herself. The word had a strange weight to it. Morning assumed a place to be when morning came. She did not have one yet. A wagon passed some time later. The man driving it was Jonas Pruitt, who had once paid her a penny to help stack feed crates behind his storage barn. He was a large, quiet man with a sun-weathered face and the slow, considered manner of someone who had spent 40 years making decisions about soil and weather and had learned that most things could not be rushed. His horse slowed when it drew level with her. Wren stood quickly and brushed dirt from her skirt. Jonas looked at the flour sack. He looked at the road behind her, then at the road ahead of her. His face moved through something she recognized, the beginning of an offer, the calculation of what that offer would cost, and the small, almost invisible flinch of a man deciding it was more than he wanted to spend. She saw it before he said a word. "Headed somewhere?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she said. "Just down the road." He nodded, and she could see the relief in it, the way a man looks when the thing he was afraid of asking him something does not. "Best get there before dark," he said. "Yes, sir." The wagon rolled on. She watched it until the dust settled back into the ruts. After that, she stopped hoping that anyone would ask twice. The sun had fallen into the lower third of the sky by the time she reached the head of the Callum track. She knew the name the way children in small towns know the names of places they have been warned away from through repetition and whisper rather than experience. The Callum blacksmith shed. The old place at the end of the mud track, past the bent cedar post, past the field where no one grazed animals anymore. The place where Ezra Callum had worked until he couldn't and then died, and his daughter had gone back to wherever she had gone, and the shed had sat empty for 2 years with its doors shut and its forge cold and its tools rusting on their nails. Some said the building was unsafe. Others said it was simply useless, which in Wren's experience was considered worse. A board leaned against the entrance to the track. Whatever it had once announced was mostly weathered away. She could make out the first letters of a name and nothing more. Wren stood at the head of the track and looked back toward town. Windows were lit in the distance. Supper fires were being struck. Doors were being pulled shut against the evening chill. None of them were opening for her. She turned toward the track. She told herself she was only going far enough to find a tree with enough canopy to sleep under without getting soaked if the sky made good on its earlier threat. She told herself it was practical, not hopeful. She had learned to be careful with hope. Hope was the thing that had kept her standing on the porch, waiting for a door that was already closed. She had gone perhaps 20 steps down the muddy track when she saw them. Hoof prints, not old ones. Not the kind of marks that weather had softened at the edges and time had filled with dust. These pressed clear and deep into the soft ground, each one distinct, each one recent, made within the last few hours when the earth was still wet from the afternoon's brief rain. Wren stopped breathing for a moment. The Callum place was supposed to be empty. She tightened her grip on the flour sack. Then she kept walking, because fear was no longer as strong as the need to know what living thing had been left out there alone. The track was narrow. Weeds leaned in from both sides. Briars caught at her skirt. Twice she stumbled where the ruts deepened and the mud sucked at her boots. Once her left foot sank to the ankle and she had to work it free with both hands, mud closing and releasing, with a sound like something unwilling to let go. She kept moving. The sky had changed by the time she reached the first buildings. The clouds that had threatened all afternoon had gathered and darkened, and now sat low over the fields with the purple, swollen look of weather that had made up its mind. The air smelled of iron and wet grass and something older, ash-stone-cold metal. The old Callum farmhouse was gone. What remained was a chimney standing alone in the middle of an overgrown lot, pointing straight up at the darkening sky like a single finger marking a place where something used to be. Around it, the outbuildings had surrendered in different ways: a barn with its roof caved inward, a storage lean-to consumed by vines, a fence line reclaimed by blackberry and cedar. But at the back of the property, half hidden by a stand of cottonwood, one building still stood. The blacksmith shed was not grand. It had never been grand. Its walls leaned and its tin roof was patched in two places with boards that had weathered to the same gray as everything else. But it stood. It held its walls upright when everything around it had given up. A stovepipe rose from one end. The front door hung slightly open, moving on its hinges with the slow, tired creak of something that had been left mid-motion. Wren stood at the edge of the yard and looked at it. Then the thunder made the decision for her. She went down the slope toward the shed with one hand out for balance, her boots slipping on wet grass, the flour sack clutched against her chest to protect what was inside it. At the bottom, the hoofprints reappeared in the mud of the yard, crossing the open ground, passing a pile of old wagon wheels gone to rust and disappearing around the side of the building. She stopped at the front door. The smell of the place came to her first: cold ash, damp wood, old iron. The smell of work that had stopped. She pushed the door a little wider and looked inside. The shed was dim. Dust lay over everything, over the broad anvil at the center, over the long workbench against the wall, over the hammers hanging in size order from iron nails, over the forge of blackened brick and stone that sat at the far end, like something that had once had a voice and had forgotten it. Tools hung in rows. A leather apron, stiff with disuse, hung from a peg near the bench. On the shelf above it, a tin cup, a box of horseshoe nails, a small stack of papers curled from damp. Everything in the shed had the quality of something set down and not yet picked up, as if the man who worked here had stepped out for a moment, as if he had simply not come back. Wren heard the sound before she stepped inside. From behind the shed. Not thunder, not wind, a slow, rough breath, the sound of something tired. She set the flour sack just inside the doorway where the rain could not reach it. She picked up a short length of wood from the ground, not to hurt anything, but because fear needs something to hold. She moved along the side wall, step by careful step, the rain beginning to fall in earnest, now tapping on the tin roof above her in a slow and steady voice. At the back corner of the shed, she stopped. The yard behind the forge was narrow. A post stood in the mud, tied to it with a rope so short and so tight that the animal could not reach the grass. Growing 3 steps from its nose was a donkey. Gray, the color of old smoke. Thin enough that the line of its ribs was visible beneath its coat. Its head hung low. One ear turned when Wren came into view, but the animal did not bray or pull or shift its weight in alarm. It breathed. That same slow, strained sound she had followed through the rain. Wren lowered the piece of wood. She stood at the corner of the shed and looked at the donkey, and the donkey looked back at her with eyes that were dark and patient and held in them the particular exhaustion of a thing that has waited too long for something it is no longer certain will arrive. Wren had spent the whole day being passed by. She recognized what she was looking at. She stepped forward slowly, one hand open, palm up, the way her mother had taught her to approach any animal that had reason to distrust people. There was mud under her nails and a cut across her knuckle from the briars, but she held her hand steady. The donkey extended his neck just far enough for his warm breath to touch her fingers. Then Wren saw the rope. It had rubbed the hair from his neck in a raw circle just beneath the jaw. The skin beneath was angry and sore, the wound the color of something that had been ignored for too long. The rope itself was thick, swollen with rain, knotted so tightly that she could see it had not been meant to be temporary. Whoever had tied this animal here had either not known when they would return or had stopped caring. "I'm going to get you out of that," she said. She went into the shed and found what she needed. On the workbench beneath the leather apron, stiff with dust, lay a small knife with a cracked wooden handle. The blade was dull, but it was a blade. She was turning to go back out when she noticed the book. It had been pushed partly under the bench, one corner swollen from old water damage. The cover had once been black. Now it was gray with dust and time. She pulled it free and wiped the cover with her sleeve. Callum Forge Ledger. She opened it only enough to see the first page. Names written in a neat, careful hand. Entries running down the page in columns, the work done, the payment received. She saw the word eggs. She saw the word firewood. She saw the words no charge written twice before she stopped looking. She tucked the ledger under her arm. Back in the yard, she knelt beside the rope. The knife was dull and the rope was thick and swollen with rain, but she worked the blade back and forth with both hands, slow and careful, never letting the edge come near the raw skin. Her fingers cramped. Rain ran down the back of her neck. The donkey stood completely still, as if he understood that movement would make this harder, as if patience was something he had learned through long practice and had kept even when almost everything else had been taken. A strand snapped. Then another. The rope loosened. Wren unwound it gently from the post and eased it away from the wound. Careful, careful. The donkey lifted his head. He stood for a moment without moving, simply occupying the space that the rope had not allowed him. Then he took one step and lowered his face to the grass and pulled a wet clump free and began to chew. Wren sat back on her heels. She watched him eat. Her own stomach was a tight and empty fist beneath her ribs, but the sight of him eating was its own kind of sustenance. She had not found food for herself. She had not found shelter. But she had changed one thing from worse to better, and in a day that had offered her nothing but closed doors and turned faces, that was not nothing. On the old harness lying near the cart shaft, something caught the fading light. Wren leaned closer and brushed mud from a small brass tag attached to the leather. The letters were scratched but readable. Cinder. She looked at the donkey. He did not look up from the grass, but one ear turned. "So that's your name," she said. A name changed things. A nameless animal was a problem. A named one had belonged somewhere to someone once. She went back into the shed. She was searching the shelves for something to use as a bandage when she found the photograph. It was nailed to one of the ceiling beams at eye level for a tall man, which meant she nearly missed it. She had to step up onto a low crossbar to see it properly. In the photograph, a broad-shouldered man stood beside a younger version of the gray donkey Cinder, with a smoother coat, ears forward, something that might have been a ribbon tied foolishly around one of them. The man had a wide, kind face and large hands, and the look of someone who had learned to carry weight without making a performance of it. Beneath the photograph, scratched into the wood of the beam in letters smaller than the ones on the brass tag, was a name. Ezra Callum. Wren stepped down slowly. She turned toward the front door. And then she saw the carving. It was not painted. It was not written in pencil or chalk. It had been cut into the inside of the door with something sharp and deliberate. Each letter pressed deep into the grain of the old wood by hands that were patient enough to leave a mark, meant to last past weather and past time and past the turning away of everyone who might have read it. Do not sell what still serves the poor. Wren read it once. She read it again. The words were simple. They did not explain themselves. But they settled into her in a way that words on paper rarely did not, as an instruction exactly, and not as a question, but as something in between. A belief left in a place where someone would need it. She did not understand the full weight of it yet. She understood enough. Outside, the rain came harder. It fell in a sudden sheet across the yard, rattling the tin roof and turning the mud path to running water. Wren hurried back out, took up the loose rope, and gently guided Cinder toward the shelter of the rear overhang. He moved slowly, stiff in the legs, but he followed. At the edge of the shed, he stopped and rested his head for one quiet moment against her shoulder. Wren went still. No one had leaned on her with that kind of plainness in a very long time. Not with need this simple and this honest. No calculation in it. No cost attached. She stood in the rain with her hand on the donkey's rough neck and listened to the old forge shed creak around them while the storm moved in from the west. She had not meant to stay. She had meant only to follow the hoofprints far enough to find out what was still alive out here. But Cinder's head was heavy and warm against her shoulder, and inside the shed there was a carving that seemed to have been waiting for someone to stand in front of it and need it. And under the workbench there was a ledger full of names that proved this place had once known what to do with a person who had nothing to offer but the willingness to work. Wren pulled Cinder closer under the overhang and stepped inside with him. The thunder rolled again behind them, and the door swung on its hinges, and the old Callum forge shed closed around them both like something that had not quite given up on being useful. The storm did not leave quietly. It pulled back before dawn, the way storms do in Kansas, not retreating so much as reorganizing, leaving behind a world that smelled of wet cedar and cold iron and the particular stillness that follows a night of being shaken. Wren woke with her back against the wall of the shed, her coat pulled over her shoulders and Cinder standing 2 feet away with his ears forward and his eyes on the door. She had slept in pieces. Each time the wind changed direction, she surfaced long enough to check the roof check. Cinder checked the small fire she had managed in a rusted coffee tin, using the last 3 dry matches from a drawer in the workbench. The fire had gone out somewhere in the middle of the night. She had not had the matches to relight it, but the shed had held. She sat up slowly, pressed both hands against the floor to feel how cold the morning was, and then stood before her body could register too many objections. The flour sack was where she had left it, propped against the base of the workbench. Inside it, her mother's photograph was dry. That was what mattered first. She checked Cinder's neck in the thin gray light that came through the cracked window above the bench. The cloth she had tied the night before was still in place. The wound beneath it looked less angry than it had. Not healed. Not close to healed. But moving in the right direction, which was more than she could say for most things at the moment. She unwrapped it, rinsed the cloth with water she had collected in the bucket from last night's rain, and wrapped it fresh. Cinder stood without flinching. He had the patience of an animal that had learned patience the hard way. "Better," she told him. He flicked one ear. She drank from the bucket herself slowly, the water tasting of tin and rain and nothing else, and then she went to the forge. She had been thinking about the forge since she found it. She had stood in front of it twice the night before and pulled back both times because a forge was not a campfire, and she knew it. A forge was a system, the firepot, the coal, the bellows that fed it air, the flue that carried the smoke. She had watched Boyd work a small furnace behind the Vane house one winter, mending a cracked iron pot with a method that was more luck than skill. She had watched carefully because she watched everything carefully. It was a habit born of understanding that knowledge was the one thing no one could take back from you once you had it. But watching and doing were 2 different countries. She opened the grate at the base of the forge and cleared the old ash with a flat piece of board she found on the floor. There was coal in the bin along the wall. Most of it was damp from years of exposure, but deep inside, where the outer pieces had acted as insulation, she found a core of dry chunks. She stacked them in the fire pot the way she remembered small pieces at the base, larger ones above, space between them for air. The bellows hung beside the forge, a large double-sided thing made of wood and leather. One side was torn at the seam. She pressed the other side experimentally. It breathed. Not well, not the full-throated movement it had once been capable of, but enough. A wounded tool was still a tool. She had no dry matches. She sat on the edge of the workbench and thought about that. The tin of matches she had found the night before was empty now, the last 3 spent. She searched the shelves again, pulling down every tin, every box, every folded piece of cloth. In the back of a drawer beneath the bench, she found a small glass bottle with a cork stopper. Inside the bottle were 6 matches protected from the damp. They looked old but dry. 6 chances. She laid them on the bench in a row and looked at them for a moment. Then she built the smallest starting fire she could, a nest of paper shavings from the ruined notices she had found on the shelf, a few splinters of dry wood from a broken crate, a pinch of straw from the corner. She set this in the center of the fire pot beneath the coal and reached for the first match. It broke. She set the pieces aside and reached for the second. It flared blue at the tip, held for 1 second, and went out. She did not allow herself to respond to this. She set the dead match with the broken one and reached for the third. It caught. The flame was small and yellow and entirely committed to surviving. She lowered it to the paper nest with steady hands because hands that shook would kill it faster than wind. The paper darkened, curled, then glowed at its edges. A thread of smoke rose. She lowered the flame further. The straw caught. She worked the bellows once gently. The glow spread. She worked the bellows again. A small orange point appeared under the first layer of coal, exactly where she had hoped it would. She watched it without moving. Then she worked the bellows once more, slow and even, and the point became a glow, and the glow became a color, and the first real heat she had felt since the night before rose from the old forge of Callum and touched her face like a question being answered. Wren stood with both hands on the bellows handle and did not speak. Cinder looked up from the rear of the shed. The fire lit the anvil red. It touched the row of hammers on the wall. It warmed the dust that had settled over everything, and for a moment the shed looked the way it must have looked when Ezra worked here, not abandoned, not forgotten, but occupied, purposeful, alive. She whispered, "Look at that." She was still looking at it when she heard the horse. The sound came from the track hooves in mud, the creak of a wagon, the particular rhythm of a working animal, moving at the pace of someone who is not in a hurry because they have already decided something, and decisions do not require speed. Wren moved to the doorway and looked out. Jonas Pruitt's wagon came into the yard. He climbed down with the slow, deliberate movement of a man whose knees had been making their objections known for several years. He was wearing his canvas overalls and his flannel shirt, and the wide-brimmed felt hat she had seen him wearing every time she had encountered him, which was not many times but enough to recognize. In his hands was a hoe. The handle had split near the head and been wrapped with a strip of leather that had not succeeded in holding it together. The iron head hung at an angle. He stopped when he saw Wren in the doorway. He looked at her. He looked at the smoke rising from the stovepipe. He looked at the doorway behind her and into the dim shed. Then he looked at her again. "You're not Ezra Callum," he said. "No, sir." He shifted the broken hoe to his other hand. "I saw the smoke from the road." He paused. "Thought maybe I was wrong about the man being dead." "You're not wrong," Wren said. Jonas looked at the hoe. He looked at the shed. His face had the expression of a man doing arithmetic he had not expected to need this morning. "I don't suppose there's anyone here who can do a repair." Wren looked at the hoe. The split was clean along the grain, which was good. The iron head had worked loose from the wood, which was less good but not beyond fixing. She thought of the sketches she had seen in the margins of the ledger the night before. Small drawings of wedges and pins and the angles at which things held. "I can try," she said. "I don't know if I can finish it, but I can try." Jonas studied her for a long moment. A 14-year-old girl with soot on her forearms, and a flour sack in the corner, and a gray donkey standing behind her in a blacksmith shed. He was a man who had been reading land and weather for 40 years, and he applied the same attention to what was in front of him now. "What would you want for it?" he asked. "Cinder needs hay," she said, "or grass if you have a cutting. Not for me, for him." Jonas glanced at the donkey. He looked at the cloth wrapped around Cinder's neck. Something moved across his face that was not quite pity, and was more than recognition. "I'll bring hay whether you fix it or not," he said. Wren shook her head. "No, sir. If I can't fix it, I'll sweep your wagon or wash something. I don't take what I don't earn." The look he gave her then was the kind that takes longer to name than to feel. He nodded once the way men nod when they have decided to take something seriously. He set the hoe on the workbench and reached for the ledger to move it aside. He stopped. He had opened it without meaning to one of those reflexive gestures of a hand, making way for something else, and his eyes had gone to the page without permission. Wren watched him. She saw the moment he found it. His name written in Ezra Callum's neat, square hand. The entry dated spring of 1886. Jonas Pruitt. Plow repair. Paid after harvest. He stood there for a moment with his hand flat on the open page. He had not come back to pay. She could see that he knew. She knew that, and she could see that knowing she knew, it cost him something he had not expected to spend this morning. He was not a dishonest man. He was a man who had let a small debt grow over 3 years until the weight of it made returning harder than not returning, which was a thing that happened to honest people too. He closed the ledger. He did not say anything about it. He did not need to. "I'll be back before evening," he said. His voice was quieter than it had been. "With hay." He left without waiting for her answer. Wren turned to the broken hoe. She found 3 replacement handles on the shelf along the back wall. One was cracked. One was too thick for the iron collar. The third was close. She would need to shape it. She found a rasp in the bottom drawer of the bench and began to work the handle down to the right diameter, pushing the file along the wood in long strokes, checking the fit against the collar every few passes. Her hands were already sore from the night before. The blisters from the rope were soft and tender at their edges. She worked anyway. This was how she had always worked. Not fast, not with any particular grace, but continuous. The way water finds its way down a hillside, not because it is strong, but because it does not stop. An hour into the work, she heard another horse on the track. This one moved differently, quicker, more deliberate. The horse that pulled Jonas's wagon had the sound of a working animal. This had the sound of a better-fed one. The wagon that came into the yard was not a farm wagon. It was a road coach, dark-painted with iron fittings that had not gone to rust. The horse was a bay with good legs and the clean coat of an animal that received regular attention. The woman who stepped down from the coach wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool with a jacket to match the collar standing the cuffs fitted. Her gloves were pale and clean. Her hair was pinned at the back of her neck with the kind of careful arrangement that did not happen in front of a cracked mirror. She looked at the shed. She looked at the smoke from the stovepipe. Then she looked at Cinder. Something happened in her face when she saw the donkey. A change that moved through her features and was gone in less than a second, like a word thought but not spoken. Then her expression closed again, smooth and controlled, the look of a person who had spent years practicing the appearance of having already decided. She looked at Wren. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Wren set down the rasp. "Working. This is private property. I didn't break anything." Wren paused. "I fixed something." The woman's eyes moved to the cloth around Cinder's neck, to the cleared floor, to the open ledger on the bench, to the forge which was still throwing a low, steady heat that had begun to warm the whole room in a way Wren had not noticed until this moment when the woman in the doorway brought the cold air in with her. "I am Delia Callum," she said. "Samuel Ezra Callum was my father. This shed, this land, and that animal are part of his estate." Wren stood very still. She had seen the photograph. She had read the name carved into the beam. She had held the ledger that bore this woman's name in its pages. School shoes, winter coat, medicine entries made by a father who had repaired other people's broken things in order to pay for the things his daughter needed without ever explaining that to her. "You're his daughter," Wren said. "That is what I said." There was a silence. Outside, the wet fields lay under the pewter sky, and a crow moved along the fence line with the slow, sidelong progress of a bird that has no particular appointment. "I have a buyer," Delia said. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and withdrew a folded set of papers. "The land will be sold. The shed will be cleared. The tools will be assessed. Whatever can be sold for scrap will be sold. The rest will come down." Wren looked at the hammers on the wall. She looked at the bellows. She looked at the forge, which was still breathing. "And Cinder?" she asked. Delia did not look at the donkey. "I will make arrangements." The words were clean and final, the kind of words that were meant to close a subject. Wren had heard words like that before. She had heard them on a porch on a morning with pale light across the boards from a woman who had packed 2 shirts and a cracked hairbrush and considered the matter settled. "He was tied out back with no water," Wren said. "The rope had rubbed the skin off his neck." Delia was quiet for a moment. "I did not know anyone was still coming to this property," she said. Her voice had shifted by a degree. "Not much. Enough." "Someone was," Wren said. "Someone tied him there and left." Something crossed Delia Callum's face, then, not guilt exactly, but its older relative. The expression of someone standing close to a thing they have been not looking at for a long time and finding it harder to not look at than they expected. "I was 14 when I left this place," Delia said. It was not an explanation. It was not an apology. It was simply a fact delivered into the space between them and Wren, who was 14 now and who had left a place this very morning, received it the way you receive something heavy handed to you without warning. She did not answer. Delia looked around the shed again. When her eyes reached the carved words on the inside of the door, she stopped. She read them once. Her jaw moved slightly the way a jaw moves when a person is keeping words inside their mouth that want to come out. "My father wrote that," she said finally. "I know. He wrote a great many things." She folded the papers and returned them to her pocket. "He believed a great many things. The believing did not keep the roof sound." Wren thought about that. She understood the logic of it. She also understood that some things were true without being the whole truth. "You can stay tonight," Delia said. "I will not put you on the road in the dark, but in the morning a man named Gerald Finch is coming to walk the property. When he comes, You need to be gone." Wren nodded. Delia returned to her coach without looking at Cinder again. Jonas returned before sunset with a bundle of Timothy hay and a second bundle he had not been asked to bring, and which he set beside the first without comment. He also brought 2 potatoes and a jar of beans, which he placed on the workbench with the same wordless deliberateness. Wren started to object. He held up one hand. "Ezra fed half this county on credit," he said. "The least this county can do is feed the girl who lit his forge." He left before she could find an answer. She had the hoe finished by the time the light failed. The handle fit firmly, the iron collar seated and tightened and fixed with a wedge. She had shaped herself, and driven with a hammer she had to hold two-handed because the grip was built for a larger hand than hers. It was not pretty. She knew it was not pretty. The wedge was a fraction off center, and the handle had a slight roughness, where she had taken too much off one side with the rasp. But the head did not move. She pressed it against the floor and pushed, and the head held, and she pressed harder, and it still held. She set it against the wall and boiled 1 potato in the dented tin cup over the last heat of the forge, eating it with the careful attention of someone rationing warmth. She gave Cinder a handful of the hay and watched him eat it with the serious patience of an animal that had learned not to trust abundance. She was sitting with the ledger open on her knees, tracing the entries in the failing light, when she heard the second wagon on the track. This one came fast. The man who climbed down from it was broad through the shoulders, wearing a brown wool coat and a bowler hat that sat too square on his head, a deliberate squareness, the kind that said the hat was there to communicate something about its owner. He carried a leather satchel. Behind him came a younger man in a gray vest who carried a roll of papers and moved with the practiced efficiency of someone used to standing slightly behind important men. Gerald Finch. He did not knock. He walked into the yard with the unhurried confidence of a man who has decided in advance that everything he is about to look at belongs to a category he already understands. He looked at the forge shed. He looked at the stovepipe. He looked at Wren in the doorway. "Who is this?" he said. He was not asking her. He was asking the air beside him, the general space in which assistance and inconveniences were expected to reside. "No one." The voice came from behind him. Delia Callum had come across from the coach without Wren hearing her. She stood at the edge of the yard with her hands clasped in front of her, and her face arranged in the composed expression of someone conducting business. "No one." The word reached Wren the way cold reaches you, not all at once, but in layers, the outermost one first, and then the deeper ones following. Delia heard it leave her own mouth. Wren saw the moment she heard it a small tightening around her eyes, a recognition she could not take back. Finch was already walking the perimeter of the shed, looking at the walls, the roof, the foundation stones. He tapped the siding in 2 places with his knuckle. He looked at the stovepipe and then at the forge visible through the doorway with the expression of a man calculating weight per ton. "Structure's compromised," he said. He was speaking to the younger man with the papers now who wrote things down. "Roof's a liability. Clear the tools first, the iron's worth something at scrap weight. Wood's mostly gone, but the stone foundation could be reused." He looked at Cinder standing in the doorway behind Wren. "Does the animal convey with the property?" "No," Wren said. Finch blinked at her. He had forgotten she was there. Delia looked at Wren. The look was complicated irritation and something underneath it that was not irritation at all. Finch set his satchel on the yard post and opened it. He produced a document several pages thick and held it out toward Delia. "I've had my attorney note the conditions of the property. Given the structural concerns, the liability to the county, and the cost of demolition, the offer I made you last month stands, but only until the end of this week. After Friday, my consortium moves on." He said consortium the way certain men say words they believe confer weight. Delia took the document and looked at its first page. Finch continued. "I've already spoken with the county assessor. There's a question of whether the shed meets current safety standards. If it doesn't, and I believe it doesn't, the county could order demolition independent of your decision. In that case, you receive nothing." The younger man with the papers watched Delia's face carefully. Wren watched it too. She saw the thing happen that she had been afraid would happen, the small, barely visible giving way in Delia Callum's expression. Not surrender. Something more complicated. The look of a person standing between what they believe and what the arithmetic requires, and finding that belief is lighter than they hoped. "I will consider it by morning," Delia said. Of course. Finch took his document back. He looked around the yard once more with the satisfied expression of a man doing final measurements on something already his. Then he looked at Wren. She should be off the property before the paperwork is finalized. He climbed back into his wagon. After the sound of it had faded down the track, the yard was very quiet. The crow that had been on the fence line was gone. The forge ticked softly as its last heat contracted the iron. Cinder stood with his head low and his eyes on the middle distance. Delia stood in the yard with the evening settling around her and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "One night, I will decide in the morning." It was not a promise. It was not a kindness. It was a small piece of time handed over the way you hand something over when you are not yet certain what else to do. Wren nodded. "Yes, ma'am." After Delia returned to her coach and drew the curtain, Wren sat on the edge of the workbench in the last light and looked at the broken pump fitting Jonas had left with the hay bundle. He had mentioned it without asking. A cast iron elbow joint from the pump on his south field cracked along a seam, the kind of small failure that on its own seemed manageable until the spring rains came and the lower field flooded and manageable became catastrophic. The planting on that field was new. It would not survive standing water. She turned the fitting over in her hands. She had never repaired iron. She had watched. She had read the margin sketches in Ezra's ledger. She had read the entries that said plow point reshaped and wagon rim straightened, as if the words themselves were a kind of instruction. She set the fitting on the anvil. She looked at the forge. She began. The coal was lower than she would have liked, and the bellows still breathed from one side only. But the fire built back up with patience. And patience was the one resource she had in sufficient supply. She heated the fitting until it showed the dull orange she was looking for. Not the bright yellow that meant too hot, not the black that meant too cold, but the color she had seen in the margin sketches beside the word workable, written in Ezra's hand. She struck. The hammer was heavier than she was prepared for, and the first blow landed wrong, not on the seam but to the left of it, and the fitting shifted on the anvil, and she lost her grip on the tongs, and the whole thing went sideways. She set it back in the fire. She waited. She tried again. The second blow was better. The third landed on the seam itself. She could feel through the hammer the way metal responds to being addressed correctly. A different quality of vibration, a sound that was less clang and more song. She worked along the crack in short strokes, not trying to close it all at once, letting the iron tell her where it wanted to go. Her arms shook. The heat from the forge was enormous and relentless. Sweat ran into her eyes, and she wiped it away with her sleeve and went back to work. An hour in the fire went out. The coal had run down to ash, and she had not noticed, too focused on the iron in front of her. And now the forge was cold, and the fitting was cooling on the anvil, and the crack was better but not closed, and she had no more coal within reach. She sat down on the floor. Her hands were shaking. The blisters from the rope were open now, the skin rawer than it had been that morning. She looked at the crack in the fitting. She looked at the empty fire pot. She looked at the darkness beyond the open door where the track ran back toward town, and the lit windows and the people in them who had decided each in their own way that she was not their problem. Cinder walked in from the rear overhang and stood beside her. His breath was warm against the top of her head. Wren pressed her face against his neck. She did not cry out loud. She made no sound at all, but she stopped holding herself in the careful, contained way she had been holding herself since morning. And for a few minutes she simply rested the full weight of the day against the side of the old gray donkey, who had been tied in this yard with no water and no grass and no one coming, and who had waited anyway. She was still sitting on the floor when she heard the first footstep on the track, then a second, then more. Jonas Pruitt came first, carrying a sack of dry coal over one shoulder and a lantern in his other hand. Behind him came two men she recognized from town, Harlan Price, who ran the sawmill on the creek road, and a farmer named Aldous Meck, whose property bordered the Callum land on the north side. Behind them came Mrs. Cotter, carrying a basket of rags and walking with her eyes slightly down, not looking at Wren directly when she came through the door. They did not announce themselves. They did not make speeches. Jonas set the coal beside the forge without speaking. Harlan brought in a box of old iron pins and bolts. Aldous carried a second lantern and hung it from the beam above the anvil without being asked. Mrs. Cotter set her basket on the bench and began folding rags into the shapes that Wren had been using as work cloths. Wren stood up. Jonas looked at the fitting on the anvil. He looked at the forge. He looked at her hands. "Tell me what you need," he said. She told him. He built the fire back up while she rested her hands in the cold water bucket. The coal caught faster this time with someone working the bellows who knew how to use both sides. When the fire was right, Wren went back to the anvil. Jonas held the lantern. Harlan Price stood near the door in case anything was needed from outside. Mrs. Cotter pressed a clean cloth into Wren's hand between hammer strokes without saying a word about it. Nobody helped her strike the iron. That part was hers alone. Wren worked the seam with steady hands, stroke by stroke, the way she had worked the rope the night before, not with force, but with continuity. The crack drew closed by degrees. She checked it. She went back. She checked it again. At some point during this, she heard paper. She did not look up. But she heard Delia Callum come through the doorway, heard the rustle of the coach coat, heard the stillness that moved through the room when the other people noticed the woman standing there. She heard a few minutes later the sound of the ledger being opened. Pages turning. More pages. Then a sound she could not name. Not a breath and not a word, but something between the two. The sound a person makes when they find their own name somewhere they did not expect it. Wren kept her eyes on the iron. She kept striking. The fitting was almost right. She could feel it in the hammer in the anvil's return, in the way the metal had begun to speak to her in the small language of vibration and resistance that she had not known existed until tonight. She made 3 more strikes. She lifted the tongs and held the piece up to Jonas's lantern. The seam was closed. Not perfect, not the work of a trained hand, but closed, and closed was what the field needed before the spring water rose. She set it on the anvil to cool and stepped back. Delia was standing at the workbench with the ledger open under her hands and a small yellow envelope held between 2 fingers. On the front of the envelope, in the same careful square hand that filled every page of the ledger, one word was written: Delia. The room was very quiet. Wren looked at the woman who had called her. No one who had arrived with legal papers and clean gloves and 17 years of distance from this place. And she saw something in her face that she recognized without being able to name the expression of someone standing at the edge of something they had been walking toward for a long time without knowing it. Delia opened the envelope. She unfolded the letter inside. Her hand holding the paper was not entirely steady. The letter was not long. Wren could tell that from across the room, from the way Delia held the single page, from the brevity of the silence before she began to read. Some things did not require many words. The most important things rarely did. Delia read without moving. The lantern Jonas had hung from the beam above the anvil threw its light across the workbench, across the open ledger, across the woman's face. In that light, Delia Callum did not look like the woman who had stepped down from the road coach with clean gloves and a set of legal papers. She looked like someone considerably older and considerably younger at the same time, which is what happens to a person when something they have carried for a long time is finally set down. The room held its silence. Jonas stood near the forge with his hands at his sides. Harlan Price looked at the floor. Aldous Meck had removed his hat at some point and was holding it in both hands without appearing to know he was doing it. Mrs. Cotter had stopped folding rags and stood at the edge of the bench with her eyes on Delia's face. Wren stood beside the anvil and looked at the closed seam on the pump fitting and did not allow herself to look at Delia, because there is a kind of grief that requires privacy, even when it happens in a room full of people, and the only decent thing you can do for it is pretend you are looking somewhere else. When Delia spoke, her voice had changed. Not broken, changed. The way iron changes when it has been worked, not weaker but different in character, the brittleness gone out of it, something more honest in its place. "My name is in here," she said. No one answered. She touched the ledger page with one finger, the way you touch something you are not sure will remain solid. "School shoes. Paid by extra wagon repairs," she read on, her voice very quiet. "Winter coat. Paid by shoeing Harlan Price's mule team." Harlan looked up from the floor. "Medicine for Anna Callum." Delia stopped on that one. Her mother's name. She was still for a moment. "Paid by repairing the church bell." She set the letter down on the bench beside the ledger and pressed both hands flat against the surface, steadying herself. He was doing extra work. Work he was not paid for, to pay for what I needed. She said it slowly, the way you say something you are working out as you speak it. I thought he was choosing strangers over us. I thought that every time he came home late, every time the roof went another season without being fixed, every time my mother put a bucket under a new leak, I thought he had simply decided that other people mattered more. The forge ticked behind her in the cooling silence. He was trying to keep the money from showing, she said. He did not want me to know we needed it. Jonas made a low sound that was not quite a word. Delia picked up the letter again. She read the last part aloud and her voice was steady through most of it, and then it was not, and she did not apologize for that. Her father had written, I should have told you I was proud of you. I should have come inside sooner. I should have patched our own roof before I patched another man's wagon. A good purpose does not excuse a tired daughter waiting at home. But every time I fixed a tool for a man with children, I told myself I was not choosing them over you. I was trying to keep the kind of world around you where a poor person did not have to lose everything because one thing broke. I wanted that world for you. I was not wise enough to explain it while I had the chance. Delia folded the letter. She held it against her chest for a moment with both hands, the way you hold something you have waited a long time to receive and are not yet ready to put down. Then she unfolded the smaller paper that had been clipped behind the letter. This one had a notary stamp in the corner, faded but legible. She read it without speaking. Her eyes moved across the lines twice. Then she looked up at the carved words on the inside of the door. Do not sell what still serves the poor. It was not just a saying, she said. Jonas stepped closer. What do you mean? Delia set the smaller paper on the bench where the lantern light reached it. My father attached a condition to the deed, a final instruction written before he died and witnessed by the county notary. She paused. The property could be sold if it no longer served its purpose. But if anyone used the forge again to repair tools for families who could not afford replacement if the shed was opened and the work continued, then the Callum property could not be sold. Not while the work continued, not for any price. The room was completely still. Wren looked at the pump fitting cooling on the anvil. She looked at the repaired hoe leaning against the wall. She looked at her own hands, the blisters open at the edges, the nails blackened from the ironwork, the strip of cloth wrapped around her right palm where the worst of it was. She had not known. She had lit the forge because a donkey needed care and a farmer needed his tool, and the shed was there and the coal was there, and the sketches in the ledger margin had shown her how. She had done it because it was the next right thing in front of her. And she was a girl who had been taught by the long practice of having nothing to address what was directly in front of her and not look too far ahead. She had not known she was fulfilling a dead man's instructions. She had simply done what Ezra Callum would have done. Delia looked at her. Not the way she had looked at her in the doorway that afternoon, not with the careful, controlled assessment of a woman managing an inconvenience. She looked at her the way you look at something that has surprised you into honesty. You didn't know, Delia said. No, ma'am. You were not trying to claim anything. I only wanted him not to be tied. Wren looked at Cinder standing quiet in the rear of the shed. And then Jonas needed his hoe, and then the pump. Delia looked at the forge, at the tools, at the people standing in her father's shed at past midnight with lanterns and coal and rags. People who had driven past this place for 2 years without stopping, who had come back tonight. Not because they were summoned, but because something had been lit in the dark and light. Even small light draws people who have been standing in the cold. She looked at Harlan Price. He met her eyes without flinching. He was a man who had gotten older since she last saw him, which was the same as saying he was a man who had kept living, which was all most people managed. Your father fixed my mill saw, he said. Twice. Once he took firewood. Once he took nothing. He paused. I should have come back to say thank you before now. Mrs. Cotter made a small sound beside the bench. Delia set the notarized paper down. She placed her hand flat on it. Then she said, Gerald Finch will be here at first light. No one spoke. I will handle Gerald Finch, she said. Wren looked up. Delia's face had the quality of a decision made cleanly without theater. Not the drama of conversion, but the quieter movement of a person who has found at the bottom of a long argument with herself the thing she actually believes. Go back to work, Delia said. All of you. They went back to work. Wren returned to the anvil. The pump fitting needed a final check. She wanted to test the seam under pressure before morning, and she had an idea about how to do it using the water bucket and her thumb against the joint. Jonas rebuilt the fire to a low, steady warmth for the testing. Harlan and Aldous moved equipment that had blocked the rear door opening the shed to the night air, which had cleared since the storm and smelled now of wet grass and approaching autumn. Mrs. Cotter came to stand beside Wren while she worked. She did not offer to help. She stood there for a moment with her hands in her apron pockets, and then she said, "I saw you by the church yesterday." Wren did not stop working. "Yes, ma'am." "I should have stopped." Wren pressed her thumb against the seam of the pump fitting and felt no give, no leak, no separation. The joint was sound. She set it down and looked at Mrs. Cotter. "Yes, ma'am," she said again. It was honest, and it was enough. Not forgiveness offered too quickly, which was its own kind of dismissal. Just the truth, which was that Mrs. Cotter should have stopped, and she had not, and now she was here, and those were all facts that could exist together in the same room without any of them being erased. Mrs. Cotter nodded. She reached into her basket and produced a jar of salve, the kind made from rendered tallow and pine resin that farm women kept for burns and rope cuts, and set it on the bench beside Wren's hand without making a ceremony of it. Wren used it. The night moved through its last hours slowly, the way nights do when people are working inside them. The forge cooled to its resting temperature. The lanterns burned down by degrees. Jonas fell asleep in a chair he had pulled from somewhere and sat in with his hat over his eyes and his breathing going deep and even. Harlan and Aldous left before midnight with promises to return in the morning. Mrs. Cotter left an hour later, quiet at the door. Delia did not leave. She sat at the workbench with the letter and the ledger and read through the pages the way you read something you are reading for the first time and also for the 100th, because you are not just reading the words, but reading the space between them, for everything that was not said while it could have been. Wren slept a few hours on the straw bed she had made for herself the first night. Cinder stood near the rear wall with his hay and his cloth bandage and his patient, ancient breathing. When she woke, the sky through the cracked window above the bench was the color that comes just before dawn, not dark and not light, but the particular gray that means the night has finished its work and is preparing to hand things over. She sat up. Delia was still at the bench, awake, the letter folded in her hands. They looked at each other across the shed without speaking. There was nothing that needed to be said first. Some understandings arrive without preamble. Wren stood, pulled on her boots, and picked up the pump fitting from the bench. "I need to go to Jonas's field before the water rises," she said. Delia nodded. Jonas woke when Wren touched his shoulder, surfacing from sleep with the quick, practical alertness of a man who has spent 40 years waking to things that required immediate attention. He looked at the fitting in her hand. He stood up. They went out into the pre-dawn gray. Wren and Jonas and Cinder, who followed without being asked, walking beside Wren with the slow, deliberate pace of an animal who has decided where his place is. Wren kept one hand near his harness the whole way across the fields, never letting the track get too rough under his feet, never letting the footing become uncertain. The south field was already wet at its edges. Water moved in the lower corner with the particular intention of water that has found a direction and means to keep it. Jonas knelt beside the pump housing and worked the old fitting loose while Wren held the lantern. Her hands ached. She held the lantern steady. The new fitting seated cleanly. Jonas worked the pump handle. Once. Twice. The water came up through the system, filled the channel, and ran in the direction it was supposed to run, away from the field along the drainage ditch, out toward the low ground where it could disperse without damage. The corner of the field stopped drinking, and the water level dropped, and the young plants in the lower rows stood in damp soil rather than standing water, which was the difference between a crop and a loss. Jonas stood up slowly. He looked at the field. He looked at the pump. He looked at Wren. Then he took off his hat. He held it at his side, and he looked at her straight, the way a man looks at someone he respects, not the charitable, effortful respect of an adult managing a child, but the plain respect of one person for another who has done something that mattered. Ezra would have done it the same way, he said. Wren did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, but she received it. She let it stand in her without arguing with it, or diminishing it, or explaining why she did not deserve it. She let it be what it was. They walked back across the fields as the sky finished its transformation from gray to the pale particular gold of a Kansas autumn morning, the kind of light that made the grass look like it was lit from below. Gerald Finch arrived at the Callum property at the time he had said he would, which was the one reliable thing about him. He came in the same wagon as the night before with the same younger man and the same leather satchel, and he stepped down from the wagon with the same unhurried confidence of a man who had already decided the shape of the morning. He stopped when he saw Delia standing at the gate. She was alone at the gate. Wren stood behind her with Cinder beside her, and his lead rope in her hand. The forge smoke rose from the stovepipe behind them both in a thin, steady column that went straight up in the still air before the wind found it. Finch looked at Delia's hands. She was holding the notarized paper. He came forward and took it when she offered it, and his younger man leaned in to read it over his shoulder, and the quality of the silence that followed had a different texture than the silences that had preceded it. This one had edges and weight, and the particular density of something that cannot be undone by wanting it to be different. Finch's jaw worked. "This is a conditional deed clause," his man said. "I am aware of what it is," Finch said. "It's been notarized and recorded with the county." "I can see that." Finch looked at the shed. He looked at the smoke. He looked at Wren. He looked at Cinder. He looked back at Delia with the expression of a man who has spent a significant amount of time constructing a position and has arrived to find that the ground beneath it has changed character. "This clause is unenforceable," he said. "Any competent attorney—" "My father's attorney," Delia said, "was Thomas Aldred of Aldred and Crane in Topeka. He is still practicing. I spoke with him yesterday evening." She paused. "He remembers the clause. He helped write it. He said it would hold." Finch rolled the document and held it out toward her. She did not take it. "The property is no longer for sale," she said. "I expect you to remove your name from the county assessor's inquiry as well. If the inquiry proceeds, Mr. Aldred will respond to it." Finch looked at the shed one more time. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has decided to categorize as a mistake and move past because the alternative is to stand in a field in the early morning light, acknowledging that he has lost something to a woman and a girl and a gray donkey, and some men find that particular accounting too costly to perform. He climbed back into his wagon. The younger man followed. The wagon turned to the yard and went back down the track, and the dust it raised was thin in the damp morning air and settled quickly, and then the track was empty and quiet, and the crow that had been on the fence line all morning resumed whatever it had been doing before the interruption. Wren let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Cinder pressed his nose against her shoulder. Marvell and Boyd Vane arrived mid-morning. Wren saw them before they saw her. They came up the track in their farm wagon, Boyd driving, Marvell sitting straight beside him with her hands in her lap and the careful expression of a woman who has prepared what she intends to say and is organizing herself to say it effectively. Wren's body remembered them before her mind did. A tightening across her shoulders, a familiar automatic diminishment, the reflex of making herself smaller, taking up less air, occupying less of the available space. She felt it happen and she recognized it for what it was. Not her own judgment, but a habit installed by repetition, like a door that swings closed on its own because it has been closed so many times she did not close. Marvell stepped down from the wagon and looked around the yard with the assessing sweep of a woman who prices things. She looked at the shed, the forge smoke, the people moving in and out of the doorway. Her expression moved through something that might have been surprise and settled into something more managed. "Well," she said, "there you are." She said it with the particular warmth of someone reclaiming a possession, the warmth that is not quite warmth, that is proximity arranged to resemble warmth for the benefit of observers. Boyd climbed down after her and stood with his thumbs in his suspenders. "We heard you found yourself a situation," he said. He looked at the shed, the tools, the smoke. He was doing arithmetic. "You can come home now if you're ready, if you've learned something from this." Marvell smiled. "Or perhaps there's wages here that—" "This girl is not wages owed to you." Delia Callum had come out of the shed behind Wren and stood at her shoulder. She was not a tall woman, but she had the quality that some people have of occupying their full space without apology, which can read as height, when it is actually something else entirely. Marvell stiffened. "She is family." "Then you should have remembered that," Delia said, "before you bolted the door." Boyd opened his mouth. He looked at Jonas, who had appeared in the shed doorway. He looked at Harlan Price, who had returned that morning as promised and stood now near the fence with his arms crossed. He looked at the general assembly of people who had come back to this place and who were without theatrics simply present. He closed his mouth. Wren looked at Marvel and Boyd Vane. She looked at them with more clarity than she had ever been able to look at them before because she was standing on ground that was not theirs and she could afford the view. She had loved them in the way you love the people who stand between you and open weather, before you understand that shelter and warmth are not the same thing. She had performed gratitude for so long in that house that she had forgotten what actual gratitude felt like, the kind that arises naturally from being genuinely helped, rather than the kind that must be produced on demand to justify your right to stand in a room. She felt sad for them in the end. Not the compressed, complicated sadness of someone who needs something from the person they're sad for. The cleaner sadness of a distance understood. "I'm staying," she said. Her voice shook on the first word. It steadied on the second. Marvell looked at her for a long moment. She was searching for something in Wren's face, the familiar anxiety, the ready apology, the reflexive reaching toward whatever the adult in the room required. She did not find it. What she found instead was a girl standing still in her own place, which was more unsettling than any argument would have been. Marvell took Boyd's arm. They turned and walked to the wagon and climbed up and turned the horse and went back down the track. Wren watched them until the bend took them from sight. She did not feel triumph. She felt the clean, quiet settling of something that had been held in suspension for a long time, finally arriving at its natural resting place. Cinder walked up behind her and put his head against her shoulder blade. She reached back and rested her hand on his nose without turning. That afternoon, Delia cleared the storage room behind the forge. She did it herself without asking Wren to help, which Wren understood as a form of apology that was more useful than the spoken kind. She dragged out broken crates and old rope and a collection of iron scraps that had been piled in the corner and forgotten. She swept the floor twice. The room was small, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a crate to serve as a table, but it had a window that faced east, and in the morning the light would come through it directly. Jonas brought a bed frame someone in town had offered when he mentioned at the feed store that there was a girl at the Callum place who needed a proper place to sleep. Harlan Price found a rope mattress that needed restuffing and restuffed it that afternoon behind the shed using fresh straw from his own barn. Mrs. Cotter arrived near evening with a quilt she said she had too many of, which was probably not true, and which Wren accepted without arguing. Aldous Meck fixed the window latch without being asked. He simply appeared with a screwdriver, tightened the mechanism, tested it twice, and left. Wren watched this from across the yard and thought about the ledger, about all the names in it, about the way a community could be a net if enough people decided to hold their portion. When the room was ready, Wren went in and stood in it. It was the first room she had been in where her presence was the reason for the room's arrangement, rather than an afterthought to it. This distinction, which might have seemed minor from the outside, was not minor from where she stood. She stood in it for a while and let herself feel the dimensions of it. Then she took her mother's photograph from the flour sack and set it on the crate beside the bed. She looked at her mother's face for a long moment. Her mother had been a woman who did things right, not because anyone was watching, but because she believed the way you did things said something about who you were. She had passed this belief to Wren not by stating it, but by embodying it, which was the only method of transmission that actually worked. "I found somewhere," Wren said. The words were quiet. They were not addressed to anyone in the room with her, but the saying of them made them true in a way that the thinking of them had not quite managed. The next morning, Wren mixed the paint. She had found a partial tin of black paint in the storage lean-to that was still usable, and a brush with half its bristles intact, and she spent the early morning working on the board she had cleaned and planed the day before, forming letters with the careful attention she gave to everything. Not fast, not confident in the stylistic sense, but deliberate. Each letter made with the understanding that it would stay. Delia watched from the doorway. When it was done, Wren carried it to the post at the head of the track and hung it where the old sign had been, on the same iron hooks that had held the Callum Forge sign before the weather took the paint off and time took the meaning with it. The new sign read Callum Forge, "Fix first, pay when you can." She stepped back. The letters were uneven. The C in Callum was slightly larger than the rest, and the second line ran a fraction downhill on the right side, which was the side she had done last when her hand was tiring. It was not the sign of a practiced painter. It was the sign of someone who meant it. Inside the shed, the carved words were still visible on the door, cleaned of dust. Now each letter as deep and certain as the day they had been cut. Do not sell what still serves the poor. Delia came and stood beside Wren at the post and looked at the new sign. He would have liked that, she said. I don't know that, Wren said. I never met him. No. Delia was quiet for a moment. But I did, and I know. From the field behind the shed, Cinder made his way along the fence line with the slow, dignified progress of an old animal that has recovered the habit of moving freely. His neck was healing. The angry red of the rope wound had faded to pink, and the new harness leather Delia had sent Jonas to town for was soft and wide and sat without pressure on the tender skin. He was not young. He would not become young. But he was moving, and the grass was wet and good, and the morning was clear over the Kansas fields in the particular way of autumn mornings, when the sky has finished its summer business and settled into the long, honest blue that holds until the cold comes. Wren looked at the line of people coming up the track. 3 farmers she knew by sight with tools in their hands, and the slightly embarrassed, slightly relieved expressions of people who have been waiting for a door to open and are not quite sure how to walk through it now that it has. A woman from the far side of town whose name Wren did not know yet, carrying a wrapped bundle that clinked with the sound of metal. An older man on horseback leading a mule that walked with a hitch in its left foreleg. She would learn their names. She would open the ledger to a new page beneath Ezra Callum's careful entries, and she would write their names in her own hand, less neat than his, the letters still working out their relationship to the line. She would write what needed fixing and what was offered in return, and in the column where Samuel Ezra Callum had written no charge when the arithmetic required it, she would write the same 2 words without hesitation, because she had been taught the value of those words by a man she had never met in a shed. She had no claim to on the night when she had nowhere else to go and nothing to offer but the willingness to try. She pulled on the leather apron. It was still too large. She folded it at the waist the way she had the first morning, and the fold held, and the apron held, and the shed held behind her, with its leaning walls and its patched roof and its anvil worn smooth at the center from 40 years of being struck correctly. Delia had gone back inside. Wren could hear her moving through the shed, the purposeful sound of a woman settling into a place she had decided to stay. Cinder lifted his head from the grass and looked at Wren across the yard. She looked back. Then she turned to the first person coming through the gate, and she asked what needed fixing, and she listened, and she began.